Advocacy group Health in the Justice Initiative is taking the Health Minister and the Health Department to court, and this to disclose all of its COVID-19 vaccine contracts that were entered into and also any applicable agreements with relevant companies and entities. The Health Justice Initiative is forcing the Health Department to open its book, so to speak, on the secret COVID-19 vaccine contracts that it signed with pharmaceutical manufacturers. This follows an access to information request to the National Department of Health, which was refused. And these deals were clinched at the height of the coronavirus pandemic, with the government relaxed, and when the government relaxed its procurement rules to try to speed up access to personal protective equipment, tests and vaccines. So for more on this litigation, we're joined virtually by the Director of the Health Initiative, Fatima Hassan. Fatima, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you, Sabrina. Great to be here.
So I think many South Africans are thinking, actually, this is a good initiative because we should know exactly what happened at that time. And seeing that we've moved on, we kind of forgot about things that had happened at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. But perhaps just to bring us all up to speed with regards to the proceedings, if you could just tell us, please, Fatima, exactly what disclosures you seek here.
Thanks. So essentially, there's two parts that we're trying to get information on. The one is the terms and conditions of all the contracts and agreements that were entered into with our government and multiple entities, including pharmaceutical companies. And the second is actually the details of the contracting parties, because we have been told, and we've asked for this information, that even that is confidential. So what we have is a situation of unprecedented secrecy, or what we call a big black box, where even the contracting parties' details are being kept very close to somebody's heart. We're not sure who's actually seen the contract. You know, the real question is, how do you have oversight over such large public procurement, which, and, you know, incidentally, the Constitution provides that we need to have transparent and fair procurement. So we, as the public, have a right to know what's in these contracts, what was agreed to in our name. And we certainly feel that there's a public interest in its disclosure, because the more secrecy you have, the more disinformation you could have, the more, anti-vaccine movements are building up. You have vaccine hesitancy. So it's in the interest of government as well as of our public health programs to rather err on the side of more disclosure. Unfortunately, these companies have insisted throughout the world that governments like South Africa had to sign non-disclosure agreements, or what we call NDAs, and not disclose any parts of those contracts, even though billions of rands of South African money has actually been spent on acquiring this vaccine. So it's quite a dangerous precedent to set in a pandemic, outside of a pandemic, even potentially under national health insurance, when the state is going to be the sole procurer of health goods, to have such high levels of secrecy.
Fatima, do we know how much government had spent all in all on these contracts?
So we certainly in the dark on that. We believe that at least 20 billion rand was spent on acquiring vaccines. That was disclosed in some parliamentary submissions on the budget. There's recent media reports that indicate up to 3.9 billion could actually be spent on vaccines that were unused. And so therefore, knowing what's included in the contracts around the return of deliveries, the donation of deliveries, the onward sale of deliveries, what happens in a situation where the companies delivered very late. As you know, that was the situation in 2021. Are we still liable for non-deliveries or late deliveries of supplies? Could we have imposed export restrictions? All of that information, including the price per vaccine, per company, the price per vaccine unused, for example, the cold storage costs, all of that is really unclear to us. And that's, you know, part of the reason why we're also bringing this case.
And with regard to the Department of Health, what were some of the reasons given to you by them for not disclosing the details of these contracts?
So mainly they've argued in their legal papers that it's the pharmaceutical company's fault, that the pharmaceutical companies in the main insisted on the non-disclosure agreements, and that were they to disclose these contracts, they would be in breach of those agreements. Potentially, they could be sued by these pharmaceutical companies. These are large, massive, multinational pharmaceutical companies that made a lot of profits off the sale of these vaccines, in particular Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And they've also said that it's not in the public interest to disclose the contracts or the contracting parties' details. So it's quite unfortunate that after being bullied by these companies into signing these secret agreements at a time when there were limited supplies, if in effect they traded secrecy for supplies, they're now defending that conduct and behavior of these companies and even refusing to tell us what the legal entities' details are, where these contracts are involved. So it's quite a, I think quite a distressing situation and also quite a dangerous situation for the future of health procurement in our country.
Fatima, I would imagine you've taken legal advice on this as well. So how do you rate your chances in actually being able to get this information, given that these massive pharmaceutical companies have great financial muscle?
Yeah, I mean, I'd hate to speculate because we are in court this morning, but we will fight it, to the highest levels because we do believe it creates a dangerous precedent. Transparency International, for example, has just reported that globally, less than 10% of the vaccine contracts signed around the world are actually open. And so, like I've said before, it's a really dangerous precedent, not just for South Africa, but globally, to have such high levels of secrecy and also such high levels of bullying, frankly, by these companies. And, it's really time for countries like South Africa, including other countries in the global south, to stand up to this. It's one thing for President Ramaphosa to stand up at global platforms and talk about vaccine inequality and vaccine nationalism and how we had to be beggars for vaccines. But then on the other hand, defend the secrecy of these pharmaceutical companies. It simply doesn't align with what the president has been saying at global platforms.
So this is one part of it, Fatima, a very important part of it. There is, of course, something that we've asked on several occasions about as well. Just in terms of how much money was actually directed towards the COVID-19 pandemic and, dealing with what that brought about. Because, and I asked you earlier, do we know how much was spent overall on this particular pandemic? Is that something that, you would hopefully also try to look at, given, the loans that South Africa entered into, loan agreements as well with Bretton Woods institutions, with the BRICS Bank, for example, because all of that, I would imagine the public would want to know as well.
Definitely. And I think part of the case is seeking the disclosure of some of those details, where you can try and put together the pieces of the different elements of the vaccine program. You must remember that you've correctly pointed out, we spend so much money and also taken out loans. We're at a point where there are going to be cuts to the national health budget. We're at a point where we can't even afford buying brand name therapeutics to treat COVID-19 or long COVID-19 in the state sector. So it really is essential to shine a spotlight on what the true costs were of this program and what the role of intermediaries were, and also what the role of other initiatives were that frankly under-delivered. They overpromised and under-delivered vaccines for which we had to pay for. So we'd like to explore all the different aspects once we get the information, including whether there were elements of wasteful expenditure, because it offers lessons for how you can then conduct procurement negotiations going forward with these multinational companies, but also in the next pandemic and also potentially, the next few epidemics.
Fatima Hassan, we're going to leave it there because you need to get to court. But thank you so much for just bringing us up to speed as the public with regard to what's happening here. Fatima Hassan is the Director of Health Justice Initiative, speaking about the legal proceedings for the disclosure of all COVID-19 vaccine contracts by government.